My name is Julia Hart. I'm in my 30s now, and for most of my life I've existed in a strange in-between space, present, but rarely acknowledged. If you looked at my life from the outside, you might think nothing particularly dramatic ever happened to me, and that assumption would be part of the story. I was never the child people worried about. I didn't scream for attention or collapse loudly when something hurt. I learned very early how to stay composed, how to anticipate expectations, how to take up as little emotional space as possible. To most people, including my own parents, I was fine, capable, quiet, replaceable. At home, that quietness slowly turned into something else. Over the years, I became less of a person and more of a background detail, someone who helped, adjusted, waited, someone whose absence wouldn't disrupt the flow of the room. And at some point, spoken casually, almost carelessly, I was labeled something I didn't even realize I was defending myself against, a waste of space. Not said in anger, not screamed, just stated, the way people state conclusions they believe are already settled. This story is not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. It's not about shouting, revenge, or humiliating anyone who once underestimated me. I'm not interested in painting my parents as villains or myself as a flawless victim. What I want to tell you is something quieter, and I think more honest. It's about what happens when neglect is subtle enough to be normalized. When being overlooked becomes so routine that you stop checking whether it's deserved. When silence isn't chosen at first, but later becomes a decision. My parents ignored me for years and called me a waste of space, until I walked into their anniversary dinner. That dinner is the moment most people focus on, but it wasn't the turning point. It was only the moment when the truth finally became visible to everyone else. What happened before that took years. It involved patience, observation, restraint, and a kind of internal recalibration that no one noticed because it didn't look like rebellion. There were no ultimatums, no slammed doors, no confrontations that would make for easy storytelling. Instead, there was a distance growing where obedience used to be. Awareness replacing hope. And preparation was happening quietly, in the background, while everyone else assumed nothing had changed. I'm sharing this story not to inspire resentment, but to explore a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't need permission, the kind that waits until it no longer needs to explain. As you listen, you won't hear exaggeration or spectacle, just a sequence of moments that, taken together, changed the direction of my life. Moments that led to a single evening where the life they dismissed was no longer invisible. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever wondered whether the people who underestimate you are doing so simply because they've never really looked at you at all? To my parents, I was never a problem to solve. And that, I would later understand, was the problem. Growing up, I occupied a role that didn't come with a name. I wasn't the golden child, the disappointment, or the one everyone worried about. I was simply there. If someone needed help setting the table, I did it. If something went missing, it was assumed I'd find a way to replace it. If emotions ran high in the house, I learned to lower my voice instead of adding to the noise. They often described me using words that sounded positive on the surface. Independent, low maintenance, mature for her age. But those words were less about who I was and more about what I didn't require. I didn't ask for reassurance. I didn't demand praise. I didn't insist on being understood. So I wasn't. At family gatherings, relatives would ask my parents about my siblings first. Their achievements, their plans, their personalities. When my name came up, it was usually followed by a pause, just long enough to signal that nothing remarkable needed to be said. Julia's doing fine, my mother would say. She's working, my father might add, as if that explained everything there was to know. No one asked me what I wanted, and after a while, no one expected me to answer. I learned to read the room quickly. I knew when to speak and when to disappear into the background. I knew that being agreeable earned approval, while needing too much earned irritation. If I had an opinion that didn't fit the tone of the room, I swallowed it. If something hurt, I told myself it didn't matter. This wasn't taught explicitly. No one sat me down and explained my place. It was absorbed slowly through patterns, through interruptions that never got corrected, through jokes made at my expense that everyone else laughed at, through plans made without checking whether I was available, interested, or even informed. When I tried to contribute, to share an idea, a concern, a small excitement, I was often met with polite distraction, phones glanced at, conversations redirected, sometimes a sigh, subtle but unmistakable, as if my words were an unnecessary delay. So I adjusted. I became efficient with my presence, brief, useful. The phrase waste of space didn't come early. It arrived after years of groundwork had already been laid. By the time it was said, it didn't shock me as much as it should have. It landed with a dull familiarity, like a verdict that had been quietly forming long before it was spoken aloud. I remember exactly where I was when I heard it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. My parents were talking to someone else, assuming I was out of earshot. My name came up casually, followed by a dismissive laugh. "She's not really going anywhere," one of them said. "Honestly," the other replied, "she's kind of a waste of space." There was no malice in the tone, just certainty. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry. I didn't even react outwardly. I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried to understand what part of me they were referring to. The part that didn't demand. The part that didn't shine loudly enough. The part that had learned to survive quietly. What struck me most wasn't the insult itself. It was the realization that they truly believed they were stating a fact. To them, I was someone who existed on the margins of relevance. Someone whose absence wouldn't be noticed until a task went undone. Someone who filled space but didn't define it. And for a long time I accepted that description. Not because it was true, but because it was unchallenged. When no one reflects your value back to you, you begin to doubt it exists at all. Still, I didn't hate them. I didn't even feel angry. I felt something colder, more neutral. A quiet understanding that the version of me they saw was incomplete, and that they had no interest in seeing the rest. That understanding didn't change anything immediately. On the outside, I remained the same Julia, reliable, calm, unassuming. But internally, something subtle had been recorded. Not resentment, not rebellion, just clarity. The first small cut wasn't obvious. That's why it stayed with me. It didn't arrive with raised voices or harsh words. No one would have stopped the conversation and said, "That was cruel." In fact, if I had mentioned it later, I suspect most people would have frowned slightly and said, "I'm sure they didn't mean it like that." That's how these things survive. We were in the kitchen one afternoon, all of us moving around each other in that familiar, unspoken choreography families develop over time. My mother was planning an event, something social, something that mattered to her. Guest list, seating, timing. The details filled the room. At one point, she paused and said, almost as an afterthought, "We'll need help with setup. Julia, you can come early." "Wouldn't you like to?" "You are not available." Just an assumption folded into a sentence. I nodded automatically. That part wasn't new. But then my father added lightly, without even looking at me, "Well, it's not like she has anything better to do." There it was. The cut. Small, casual, delivered like a joke everyone was expected to accept. My siblings smiled. Someone chuckled. The conversation moved on immediately, as if nothing had happened. I stood there holding the mug that had gone cold in my hands, aware of two things at once. First, that something had just shifted inside me. And second, that no one else had noticed or cared. I told myself it was nothing, that he hadn't meant it, that I was being sensitive. I'd been trained well in that kind of self-correction. Still, the words lingered, echoing quietly long after the room had emptied. Anything better to do? It wasn't about the task. I didn't mind helping. What cut was the assumption behind it, that my time held less value, that my life was a blank space people could write over without asking. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Small remarks, offhand comments. Plans are announced instead of discussed. Each one is easy to dismiss on its own. Together they formed a pattern. When someone needed a favor, my name came up first. "She'll handle it. She doesn't mind. She's always free." When achievements were discussed, mine were summarized quickly, if at all. When I spoke about work or interests, the responses were polite but distant. as if listening was optional. No one was cruel. That was the most confusing part. There was no villain to point to, just a gradual erosion of consideration. I remember one evening in particular. We were all sitting together, conversation drifting. I mentioned a professional opportunity I was excited about. Not bragging, just sharing. My mother nodded, then turned to my sibling and asked an unrelated question mid-sentence. I stopped talking. No one noticed. That was the moment I realized something important. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to provoke defense, but it was consistent enough to shape perception. Not just theirs, mine too. I began to anticipate dismissal before it happened. I edited myself in advance. I offered less, asked for nothing. It felt easier that way, safer. And still, I told myself this was normal. That families were imperfect, that everyone felt overlooked sometimes. I didn't want to dramatize something so subtle. I didn't want to be the person who made a fuss over tone or phrasing. So I absorbed it. But absorption has a cost. Each small cut, left unacknowledged, teaches you where you rank. It teaches you what is expected of you and what is not. I wasn't expected to be consulted or celebrated or taken seriously. I was expected to be available. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, that expectation began to change the way I looked at the room. In conversations, at myself. Not with anger, with attention. Once something happens often enough, it stops registering as an event. It becomes atmosphere. That's what the disrespect turned into. Background noise I learned to live inside. At first, I noticed every slight, every interruption, every assumption. But over time, reacting to each one felt exhausting, even indulgent. So I adjusted my expectations instead. I told myself that this was simply how my family communicated, that they didn't mean harm, that I was imagining patterns because I was looking for them. Normalization is a powerful anesthetic. I became skilled at explaining things away before they reached the surface of my emotions. If my opinion was overlooked, it was because the topic wasn't important. If my contribution went unacknowledged, it was because recognition wasn't necessary. If my presence felt optional, it was because I valued independence. I learned how to reframe absence as freedom. There were dinners where I barely spoke, not because I had nothing to say, but because it was easier to listen than to interrupt the rhythm of a conversation that didn't leave space for me. When I did speak, I kept it brief, neutral, non-threatening. I learned which topics were safe and which ones drew that subtle tightening of the room. The sigh, the glance, the shift that signaled this is unnecessary. So I stayed necessary, but not essential. I took on responsibilities without being asked. I filled logistical gaps. I made myself useful in ways that didn't require acknowledgement. There was a strange comfort in that. Usefulness, at least, came with a clear function. Value, on the other hand, felt unpredictable. Sometimes I wondered if I was complicit in my own invisibility, if my silence taught them how to treat me. But that thought felt unfair. I had been silent because speaking hadn't changed anything, because learning to endure quietly had once been a form of survival. Still, the longer it went on, the more it shaped my internal landscape. I stopped expecting curiosity. When someone asked, "How are you?" I gave efficient answers. Fine. Busy. Same as always. I didn't offer details unless pressed. I didn't volunteer excitement. It felt safer to keep things contained. There were moments, small, almost absurd ones, that made the pattern undeniable. A family photo, where I was cropped oddly, half visible at the edge. A group message where plans were finalized before I was added. A decision made for everyone that didn't account for my schedule, my preferences, my existence beyond convenience. Each time I felt a flicker of something, not anger, recognition. And then I did what I had learned to do best. I rationalized. They're just busy. They assume I'm flexible. It's not intentional. Intent became the excuse that allowed impact to go unexamined. I told myself that love didn't have to look a certain way, that families expressed care differently, that my role, quiet, reliable, undemanding, was simply how I fit into the system. But systems don't stay neutral. They reward certain behaviors and erase others. The more I accommodated, the more invisible I became. The less I required, the less I was considered. It wasn't malicious. It was efficient. And efficiency doesn't ask questions. I remember sitting alone one evening, replaying a conversation from earlier that day. Nothing dramatic had happened. Just another assumption, another casual dismissal. But something about it lingered, I asked myself for the first time without immediately dismissing the thought. If I weren't here, what would change? The answer came too quickly. Tasks would be redistributed. Someone else would arrive early. Another person would step in. There would be minor inconvenience, but no disruption. That realization didn't hurt the way insults do. It settled quietly, heavily. I wasn't essential to the emotional structure of the family. I was an accessory, useful but interchangeable. And still, I stayed. I didn't pull away. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even acknowledge this truth out loud, because by then staying quiet wasn't just a habit. It was an identity. I was the one who didn't need much, the one who didn't mind, the one who was always fine. And when you're always fine, people stop checking. I didn't yet know what I would do with this awareness. I only knew that something had shifted internally. A subtle recalibration, a line drawn, not in anger, but in understanding. Disrespect, once normalized, stops being a shock. It becomes information. Every system assigns roles, not formally, not out loud, but through repetition. Mine had already been decided long before I noticed it. I was the reliable one, the flexible one, the person who could be counted on to adjust without complaint. If someone else said no, I was the backup plan. If something needed to be done quietly and efficiently, it somehow became my responsibility. No one asked if I wanted that role. It simply settled around me, like dust. At first I wore it with a kind of muted pride. Being dependable felt like being trusted. Being needed, even in small, unacknowledged ways, felt better than being ignored entirely. I told myself that this was maturity, that I was above needing validation. But the longer I stayed in that role, the clearer its boundaries became. I was not the one whose opinions shaped decisions. I was not the one people worried about disappointing. I was not the one whose absence would raise questions. I was the infrastructure, necessary but unseen. There were moments when the role revealed itself starkly. Family conversations about the future, about support, about expectations, conversations that happened in front of me, but not with me. Plans that assumed my availability without acknowledging my autonomy. Statements that framed my life as an extension of theirs, rather than something separate and self-directed. Once, someone joked that I was lucky because I didn't have as many responsibilities as the others. I smiled automatically, even as I realized how little they understood about the weight of being taken for granted. Because being invisible doesn't mean being free. It means being unprotected. If I failed, it would be noticed. If I succeeded, it would be absorbed into the background. That asymmetry defined my position more clearly than any label could. I began to see how others interacted with me, the tone they used, the way instructions were phrased instead of requests, the casual certainty that I would comply. No malice, just expectation. And expectation is powerful when it goes unchallenged. I remember a moment that crystallized this understanding. A decision was being discussed, one that directly affected my time and finances. I listened as options were weighed, compromises debated. My name came up only at the end, as a conclusion. Well, Julia can adjust, someone said. Should we ask? Not what does Julia think, just she can. I realized then that my role wasn't just assigned, it was relied upon. The system worked because I made it work. My flexibility smoothed over friction. My silence prevented conflict. And in doing so, I had taught them something dangerous, that my consent was automatic. This wasn't about my parents alone. It was about how patterns spread. Once a role is established, everyone else adjusts their behavior around it. My siblings mirrored it. Relatives followed suit. Even I began to anticipate it, stepping into the role before anyone else had to ask. I wasn't resentful, not yet. Mostly I was observant, because something else was happening at the same time. As I became more aware of the role I'd been assigned, I also began to understand its limitations. A role defines what is expected, but also what is not. And once I saw that clearly, it gave me a strange sense of freedom. They didn't expect me to challenge decisions. They didn't expect me to have leverage. They didn't expect me to change the structure. which meant they wouldn't see it coming if I did. I didn't act on that thought immediately. I wasn't planning anything. I was still fulfilling my role, still showing up, still being the person they recognized. But internally, something shifted. I stopped confusing my role with my identity. I began to understand that what they relied on me for was not who I was, but what I provided. And provision, once recognized, can be adjusted, withdrawn, redirected. The role I was assigned had made me invisible, but it had also made me underestimate, and that, I would later realize, was not a weakness. It was leverage. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no final straw dramatic enough to point to later and say, that was it. If you had been there, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. It was an ordinary day, folded into dozens of other ordinary days. That's what made it decisive. I was sitting alone in a quiet public space, waiting, not impatiently, just waiting the way I had learned to wait for most things, for plans to solidify, for decisions to be made, for other people to finish talking so I could fit myself around the outcome. I had been asked again to rearrange something in my schedule, not requested, informed. The message was brief, casual, and confident in my compliance. And for the first time, I didn't respond right away. Not because I was busy, not because I was upset, but because I noticed how automatic my agreement had become. I reread the message slowly. The wording, the assumption, the absence of curiosity about my availability, my priorities, my life outside of what I provided. Something inside me paused. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was a quiet, almost clinical awareness. This is how it works because I allow it to. That thought didn't accuse me. It didn't shame me. It simply existed, clear and steady. I looked around the room. People moving with intention. Conversations overlapping. Everyone occupies space without apology. No one shrinks to accommodate a system that didn't see them. And I realized, without drama, without emotion, that I had been waiting for permission that was never coming. Permission to be considered. Permission to matter. Permission to be more than useful. That permission had never been denied explicitly. It just had never been offered. And suddenly I understood something fundamental. If I continued as I was, nothing would change. Not because they were cruel, but because the system was stable. It worked. It had no incentive to evolve. That clarity didn't make me want to confront anyone. It didn't make me want to explain myself. It made me want to stop explaining to myself why I accepted less than mutual regard. I responded to the message later than usual, not with resistance, not with justification. Just, I can't make that work. No explanation, no apology, no alternative offered. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. It felt oddly neutral, like adjusting a setting that had been miscalibrated for years. The response came quickly, surprise wrapped in politeness. A follow-up question, a suggestion that maybe I could just this once. I read it. I closed my phone. I didn't reply immediately. That moment, small, contained, invisible to anyone else, was the shift. Not because I said no, but because I noticed how much discomfort that simple boundary caused. And instead of rushing to relieve that discomfort, I let it exist. That was new. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel defiant. I felt aligned, as if something inside me had quietly taken its proper place. I thought about all the times I had said yes reflexively, all the adjustments I had made without being asked, all the ways I had translated other people's convenience into my responsibility. And I realized I was tired. Not physically, not emotionally, but structurally. Tired of holding a position that required constant self-erasure. That day, I didn't announce a change. I didn't decide to become someone else. I simply stopped overriding myself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But once you notice the exact moment you stop betraying your own boundaries, you can't unsee it. The world didn't collapse. No one accused me of anything. Life went on. The system adapted slightly, awkwardly, and I observed it carefully. Because this shift wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about punishment or correction. It was about recalibration. Silence, I realized, didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean choice. And that understanding, quiet, steady, irreversible, was the beginning of everything that followed. After that day, nothing changed on the surface, and everything changed underneath. I didn't become louder. I didn't start asserting myself in ways that would draw attention. I didn't explain my boundaries or announce a new version of myself. To anyone watching, I was the same Julia I had always been. Calm, reasonable, present, but my silence had shifted its meaning. Before, silence had been something I slipped into to avoid friction, a reflex, a habit formed from years of learning that speaking up rarely altered outcomes. It had been passive. Now silence was deliberate. I began to notice how often people filled the space I left open. When I didn't immediately agree, others rushed to justify. When I didn't volunteer, someone else had to step forward. When I didn't smooth things over, small tensions surfaced that I had previously absorbed without comment. No one said anything about it directly. They couldn't. From the outside, I hadn't done anything wrong. I was still polite, still responsive, still engaged. I just wasn't compensating anymore. Requests came the way they always had. Assumptive, casual. I met them with measured responses. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes let me think about it. The words themselves weren't radical. What was new was that they came without guilt, and that unsettled people. Not because they felt wronged, but because they felt a shift in balance they couldn't name. I watched how quickly my silence was misinterpreted. When I paused, it was read as uncertainty. When I declined, it was seen as an inconvenience rather than a choice. When I didn't explain myself, people filled in the gaps with assumptions that made them more comfortable. I let them. There was power in that restraint, not aggressive power, not dominance in the obvious sense, something quieter. I stopped preemptively clarifying my intentions. I stopped softening boundaries with apologies. I didn't withhold kindness, but I no longer used it to erase myself. And slowly, I noticed something else. They underestimated what I was doing because they couldn't see it. They thought my silence meant compliance, the way it always had. They thought my calm meant nothing had changed. They assumed the structure was intact. Meanwhile, I was paying attention. I observed patterns. Who relied on me most? Which systems quietly depended on my flexibility? Where my absence would create friction? Not chaos, just inconvenience. I took mental notes, not with the intent to disrupt, but to understand. Understanding is always the first form of leverage. I also became more intentional with my energy. I invested it where it was reciprocated. I stopped overfunctioning in spaces where my effort disappeared into expectation. I redirected focus inward, toward my work, my finances, my autonomy. None of this looked dramatic. It looked like maturity, like busyness, like distance. People rarely question those. There were moments when the old reflex tried to return, when I felt the urge to explain, to justify, to smooth over discomfort that wasn't mine to manage. Each time I paused, not to suppress myself, but to choose consciously. That pause became my anchor, and with it came a strange sense of relief. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending maintaining equilibrium for everyone else. How often I'd mistaken peacekeeping for peace. Silence, when chosen, creates space. Space to think, space to observe, space to prepare. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I wasn't plotting a reveal. I was simply aligning my actions with the truth I had finally acknowledged. My presence had value, whether or not it was recognized. If others chose not to see that, it didn't obligate me to compensate. They continued to assume I would be there, that I would adjust, that I would absorb. And because they assumed it so completely, they never noticed when the foundation began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough. Silence had once made me invisible. Now it made me unreadable. And that distinction mattered more than they knew. While everything looked the same to them, my inner life had become precise. I didn't withdraw emotionally in a dramatic way. I didn't announce distance or create tension. I stayed present just enough to remain familiar. That was important. Familiarity lowers suspicion. It keeps people comfortable. And comfort is where attention relaxes. What they never noticed was how intentional I had become. I started documenting, not in a paranoid way, not obsessively, just quietly, methodically, conversations, expectations, patterns of reliance, who asked, who assumed, who deferred responsibility without realizing they were doing it. I paid attention to timing, tone, and frequency, not to accuse anyone later, to understand the structure, because once you understand a structure, you know exactly where it depends on you. I also began learning things I'd never bothered to learn before. Practical things, financial literacy that went beyond budgeting, contract language, obligations hidden in casual agreements, the mechanics behind favors that were never framed as favors. I realized how often I had been agreeing to things without realizing what I was agreeing to. That awareness sharpened quickly. At the same time, I started repositioning myself professionally, quietly. No announcements, no social media updates that invited commentary. I expanded skills that made me less interchangeable. I built credibility in spaces my family didn't pay attention to, because they had never considered that part of my life important enough to follow closely. That disinterest worked in my favor. They assumed my work was stable, unremarkable, predictable. They didn't ask questions. They didn't probe. They didn't realize how much autonomy I was building piece by piece. I also re-examined old agreements, the informal ones, the of course she will arrangements that had never been spoken out loud but had shaped years of my availability. I looked at where I was providing support that had quietly become expected, and what would happen if I didn't. Not catastrophes, just gaps. And gaps reveal truths. I noticed how rarely anyone checked in on me, how questions flowed in one direction, how updates were delivered rather than exchanged. That absence of curiosity confirmed what I already knew. No one was tracking my inner state closely enough to notice a change. So I changed strategically. I stopped being predictably accessible. I replied slower, not inconsistently, just slower enough to disrupt assumptions. I stopped arriving early automatically. I didn't volunteer information unless asked. I declined small things occasionally, calmly, without justification. Each adjustment was minor. Together, they rewired expectations. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. People adapt quickly when they think something is temporary. She's busy lately. She's got a lot going on. It's probably just a phase. They told themselves stories that preserved the old structure. I let them. Meanwhile, I kept learning. I learned where emotional labor had been outsourced to me. I learned how often my calm presence had stabilized rooms that would otherwise feel tense. I learned which relationships were reciprocal and which ones were sustained entirely by my effort. Most importantly, I learned that no one was watching closely enough to see the preparation happening, because preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like routine, like patience, like someone staying in their lane. There were moments when I almost laughed at the irony. The same invisibility that had once diminished me now protected my process. No one questioned my silence because they were used to it. No one interrogated my independence because they had never valued it. They had underestimated me for so long that it never occurred to them I might be positioning myself. And that wasn't their fault alone. Underestimation is a shared illusion. It exists because one side benefits from comfort, and the other side learns how to operate quietly inside that comfort. I wasn't angry as I noticed all this. I felt focused, clear. I wasn't collecting grievances. I was collecting data. And data has a way of clarifying decisions long before emotions catch up. By the time they sensed that something was different, the foundation had already shifted. The work had already been done. The dependencies had already been identified. They just didn't know it yet, because the most effective changes don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves only when they're complete. The private reveal didn't feel like a victory. There was no rush of adrenaline, no urge to tell anyone, no sense of triumph waiting to be shared. When it happened, I was alone, sitting quietly, reading something I had already read more than once, and suddenly I saw it clearly. It wasn't new information. That was the unsettling part. Everything I needed to understand had been in front of me for a long time, embedded in habits, expectations, and unspoken arrangements I had never questioned deeply enough. The reveal wasn't about discovering something hidden. It was about finally accepting what was already true. I realized how much of my family's stability relied on my consistency. Not emotionally, they had never leaned on me that way, but structurally. I was the buffer, the quiet adjuster, the one who absorbed inconvenience before it ever reached the surface. I had mistaken that role for insignificance. In reality, it was load-bearing. Once I saw that, everything rearranged itself internally, not with excitement, but with clarity. the kind that feels almost sobering. If I stepped back, not dramatically, not cruelly, certain systems would strain, not collapse, just enough to be noticed. And if I redirected my energy elsewhere, those systems would have to adapt without me. That was the leverage. Not money alone, no information, not exposure, but absence. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. Because leverage isn't inherently virtuous. It's simply capacity. What matters is how you use it. And I knew instinctively what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't threaten. I wouldn't confront in anger. I wouldn't demand recognition or apologies that would mean nothing if forced. This wasn't about teaching them a lesson. It was about choosing myself without needing their permission. I looked back over years of interactions with new eyes. Not to relive them, but to reinterpret them. I could see now how my reliability had been mistaken for limitlessness, how my calm had been read as consent, how my silence had been confused with the absence of thought. They hadn't known who I was because they had never needed to. That realization softened something in me, not toward them, but toward myself. I stopped framing the past as something to correct. It didn't need correction. It needed closure. The reveal clarified my options. I could continue as I was and remain essential but unseen. I could confront them and risk becoming emotional noise. Or I could quietly step into alignment with my own values and let reality do the explaining. Only one of those felt honest. That evening, I didn't change anything outwardly. I didn't withdraw suddenly. I didn't test my leverage. I simply acknowledged it, and that acknowledgement changed how I carried myself. There's a difference between knowing something intellectually and letting it settle into your posture, your timing, your decisions. I felt that difference immediately. I slept better that night, not because something had been resolved, but because something had been decided. I no longer needed to wonder whether I mattered in that system. I understood exactly how I fit, and understanding removes confusion, even when it doesn't remove pain. The private reveal didn't make me feel superior. It made me feel free. Free from hoping they would someday see me differently. Free from explaining myself in rooms that weren't listening. Free from performing reliability as a substitute for worth. The life they dismissed had never been invisible because it lacked substance. It had been invisible because no one had been looking, and because I had stayed where being unseen was rewarded. I didn't resent them for that anymore. Resentment requires expectation, and mine had finally dissolved. What replaced it was something quieter and far more stable, certainty. I knew what I would do next, not in detail, not yet, but in direction. I would move without announcement. I would act without explanation. I would let outcomes speak where words never had. The reveal wasn't something I shared. It was something I carried. And once you carry that kind of clarity, you don't rush. You proceed. Clarity doesn't demand speed. Once I understood what I held and what I didn't need to hold anymore, I didn't act immediately. I let the understanding settle. Decisions made too quickly still belong to the moment that provoked them. I wanted mine to belong to me. This was the decision point. Not dramatic, not visible, just a quiet narrowing of paths. There were several directions I could take, and I examined each one honestly. I could confront my parents directly, lay everything out, explain how their words and assumptions had shaped me, ask for recognition, ask for change. That option appealed to a part of me that still wanted to be understood. But understanding, I realized, isn't something you can request from people who have benefited from not offering it. I could also withdraw completely, reduce contact, create distance so clean and firm that no one could misunderstand it. That option promised relief, but it also felt reactive, like a response rather than a choice. I didn't want my life to be defined by what I was escaping. The third option was quieter and irreversible. I could stay present, but no longer available in the ways that sustain the old structure. I could redirect my energy, my time, my competence toward a life that didn't require translation or justification. I could let the consequences emerge naturally, without accusation. That option required patience. It also required trust in myself. I thought carefully about what I wanted, not from them, but from my own future. I wanted autonomy that didn't depend on emotional approval. I wanted relationships that responded to boundaries without resentment. I wanted to know that my value wasn't conditional on how much inconvenience I absorbed. Those things couldn't be negotiated into existence. They had to be lived. So I chose the option that didn't ask for permission. The irreversible part wasn't what I would do. It was what I would stop doing. I would stop filling gaps that weren't mine. I would stop adjusting automatically. I would stop translating neglect into tolerance. That decision didn't require an announcement. In fact, announcing it would have undermined it. The system needed to experience the absence, not hear about it in advance. Once I chose, something unexpected happened. I felt calm, not numb, not detached, just steady. The anxiety that used to accompany interactions with my family, the constant calculation of tone, timing, usefulness, began to fade. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I wasn't preparing explanations in advance, because I had already decided. I didn't need their reactions to validate my choice. I didn't need agreement. I didn't even need acknowledgement. The decision belonged to me alone. In the days that followed, I noticed how differently I moved through familiar spaces. I listened more than I spoke, not out of habit, but out of discernment. I responded when it aligned with my values, not with expectations. I was still kind, still respectful, but no longer compensating. This wasn't a strategy designed to punish anyone. It was alignment, and alignment has a gravity of its own. Once you step into it, certain paths close naturally. I didn't know exactly when the effects would become visible. I only knew they would, because systems always reveal their dependencies eventually. The decision point wasn't a moment of confrontation. It was a moment of authorship. I chose the direction of my life without narrating it to anyone else. And that choice, once made, couldn't be reversed, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. From that point on, everything I did followed a different logic. Not the logic of keeping peace, not the logic of staying useful, but the logic of self-respect. Once the decision was made, action followed quietly. Not all at once, not in ways that invited attention. I didn't overhaul my life overnight or signal a turning point. I simply began moving according to the rules I had already accepted internally. Silence became my method. I took care of practical matters first, the kind no one notices until they're missing. I reviewed commitments I'd made casually over the years, financial contributions, recurring obligations, informal arrangements that had never been questioned because I had never questioned them. I adjusted them carefully, legally, cleanly, without conflict. Where something could be phased out, I phased it out. Where support could be restructured, I restructured it. Not abruptly, not punitively, just enough to reflect reality rather than assumption. I didn't announce these changes, there was no reason to. Announcements invite negotiation. I wasn't negotiating anymore. At the same time, I strengthened my own position. I consolidated accounts, formalized agreements, clarified boundaries in writing where necessary. None of it looked dramatic. It looked responsible, sensible, boring even. That was the point. I also redirected time. Time that had once been left open just in case was now allocated deliberately. To work that expanded my independence. To relationships that responded to reciprocity. To myself. When invitations came that assumed my availability, I answered with precision. Yes, if it fits. No, if it didn't. Sometimes I won't be able to make it this time. No explanation beyond that. People adjusted. At first, without comment. Assumptions are resilient. They don't shatter immediately. They bend. They wait for correction. None came. I could feel the system recalibrating around the space I no longer filled. Not in anger, in confusion. Someone else had to arrive early. Someone else had to follow up. Someone else had to smooth over the awkwardness that I had once absorbed instinctively. It wasn't chaos, just friction. And friction makes things visible. I remained present enough to observe. That was important. I didn't disappear. I attended events. I engaged in conversations. I smiled. I listened. From the outside, I was unchanged. From the inside, I was no longer carrying weight that wasn't mine. There were moments when I sensed discomfort, small hesitations, glances exchanged, questions that lingered just long enough to signal something felt off. No one asked directly. They didn't yet know what to ask. And I didn't volunteer explanations. Moving in silence requires discipline. The temptation to clarify, to make things easier for others, was still there. I recognized it as an old reflex. I let it pass, because clarity for them would have come at the cost of coherence for me. This wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about allowing consequences to surface naturally, without interference. Interference would have softened the truth, and the truth needed space. I noticed how differently people treated me when I stopped being endlessly available, not with hostility, but with a new kind of attention. Questions became more deliberate. Requests are more carefully worded. Boundaries, once established, change tone before they change behavior. Still, no one saw the larger picture. They couldn't. They were focused on the immediate adjustments, not the pattern forming underneath. That pattern was simple. My life no longer revolved around accommodating theirs, and because this shift wasn't announced, it wasn't resisted. Resistance requires a target. Silence offers none. I didn't know when the full consequences would arrive. I only knew they would, because systems that rely on invisible labor eventually expose that reliance. Until then, I moved steadily, quietly, without spectacle. The life they dismissed was reorganizing itself, and they were still assuming nothing had changed. The consequences didn't arrive with drama. They arrived as an inconvenience. At first it was subtle enough that no one named it. A missed detail. A plan that felt slightly disorganized. A moment where something that usually just worked required discussion. Someone forgot to bring something essential. Someone arrived late and no one covered for them. Someone assumed a task had been handled, only to realize no one had actually taken responsibility. These were small things, individually insignificant, collectively disruptive. I noticed them immediately, not with satisfaction but with recognition. These were the spaces I used to occupy without being seen. What fascinated me was how people reacted. At first they looked around, confused, mildly irritated, then corrected course. Someone stepped in. Someone improvised. The system compensated, the way systems do when they assume a temporary malfunction. She must be busy. She probably just forgot. She'll handle it next time. They didn't say my name, but I heard it in the subtext. I stayed quiet, present, observant. Then the disruptions repeated. Not catastrophes, patterns. A conversation stalled because no one mediated tone. The decision dragged because no one organized follow-through. An emotional moment escalated because no one softened the edges. I watched people begin to feel the absence without identifying its source. That's how dependency reveals itself, not through loss, but through confusion. Someone commented lightly that things felt more complicated lately. Someone else laughed it off and said people were just out of sync. Still, no one looked at me, because they had never associated me with structure, only availability. The turning point came when inconvenience turned into consequence. A commitment fell through, not because of malice or neglect, but because no one had quietly ensured it would hold. There was a moment of silence when everyone realized the gap was real. And then came irritation, not directed at me, not yet, but outward, unfocused, under certain circumstances, at the timing, at each other. I felt it in the room. The tension that used to dissipate quickly now lingered. Conversations grew sharper. People interrupted more. Small frustrations are stacked instead of dissolving. I had once absorbed that friction automatically. Now it remained. Someone finally asked, half joking, "Didn't Julia usually take care of this?" The room paused just a fraction of a second. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't defend myself. I didn't volunteer to fix it. Someone else answered, "I guess she's not doing that anymore." The words hung there, heavier than intended. I met no one's eyes. I didn't need to. From that point on, awareness began to spread, not fully formed, not conscious, but enough to unsettle assumptions. People adjusted their tone when speaking to me. Requests became more careful, less automatic. Still, no one apologized. No one acknowledged the past. They weren't ready for that. What they were ready for was discomfort, and discomfort is a teacher. They were learning, slowly, that the smoothness they had taken for granted had a source. That reliability had not been infinite. That someone they had dismissed as inconsequential had been quietly holding things together. I felt no urge to correct them. This wasn't a misunderstanding that required explanation. It was an experience that required time. There was a moment, brief, unspoken, when I sensed panic flicker. Not fear, concern. The realization that something fundamental had shifted and might not return to its original shape. That was when I knew the process had reached a point of no return. Because once people feel lost before they understand it, they start searching for the cause. And when they finally see it, it's rarely comfortable. I remained calm throughout it all, not detached, just steady. The consequences had begun, and they were unfolding exactly as they needed to. By the time they tried to fix things, the damage wasn't dramatic. It was structural. At first, the attempts were subtle, almost polite, a little more attention and conversation. Questions asked with a softness that hadn't been there before. Invitations phrased more carefully, as if tone alone might restore what had shifted. "Are you free this weekend? We were wondering what you thought about this. You've been quiet lately? Everything okay?" On the surface, it looked like concern, but timing matters. Concern that arrives only after inconvenience is not care. It's correction. I answered kindly. Briefly. Honestly, but without expansion. Yes, I was fine. No, I wasn't free. I hadn't changed. Circumstances had. They didn't know what to do with that. What they were trying to recover wasn't my presence. It was my function. The smoothness, the ease, the way things used to be resolved without effort. And they didn't yet understand that those things were never automatic. They had been maintained. As pressure mounted, the tone shifted. Not to anger, but to unease. Conversations felt tentative, as if everyone was walking around an invisible fault line. Someone tried to joke about getting the old Julia back. I smiled gently. That phrase landed with more weight than they intended. The old Julia wasn't lost. She was finished. There was a moment, quiet, almost awkward, when one of my parents tried to revisit the past. Not directly, not with accountability, just a vague statement about how everyone gets overlooked sometimes, and how family doesn't always say things the right way. It was an opening. Years ago, I would have stepped into it eagerly. I would have explained, offered reassurance, helped translate discomfort into resolution. This time I didn't. I nodded. I let the comment pass, not because it was untrue, but because it was incomplete. They weren't asking to understand. They were asking for restoration without reckoning, and that wasn't something I could provide anymore. I could feel their frustration growing, not at me exactly, but at the loss of predictability. They were trying to reestablish a familiar rhythm without addressing why it had changed. That's when I realized something important. Even if they had apologized perfectly, it wouldn't have reversed anything, because the change wasn't emotional, it was directional. I had already reorganized my life around a different center. My time, my priorities, my sense of self no longer revolved around being useful to them. Even if they suddenly saw me clearly, the version of me they were trying to reach no longer existed in that form. They sensed that. That's what scared them. There was a moment when one of them asked, carefully, whether I was upset, whether something they'd done had caused distance. The question came too late, not because I was holding a grudge, but because distance had already become my equilibrium. I wasn't withdrawing. I was standing where I belonged. "I'm not upset," I said calmly. And it was true. What I didn't say was that peace doesn't always mean proximity. They looked relieved and confused. They wanted a resolution, closure, something they could point to and say, "We fixed it." But some things aren't broken in ways that allow repair. They're outgrown. I didn't feel triumphant watching them struggle to recalibrate. I felt clear about what I would no longer offer, clear about what I didn't need to receive. The window for fixing things the old way had closed quietly, long before they noticed it was there. Not because I slammed it shut, but because I walked through it and didn't look back. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic revelations that shifted the mood of the room. It took place on an ordinary afternoon, in a familiar space with the kind of stillness that usually follows too many unspoken thoughts. One of my parents asked if we could talk. Not urgently, not angrily, just carefully. I agreed. We sat across from each other, the distance between us physical but not hostile. I noticed how deliberate their tone was, measured, tentative. This wasn't an accusation. It was an attempt to regain footing. They said they felt I had pulled away. Those things felt different, that they didn't understand what had changed. I listened without interrupting. Not because I was shrinking, but because I no longer needed to fill the silence to make others comfortable. I let them finish. When it was my turn, I didn't recount history. I didn't list examples. I didn't bring up the words that had once cut so deeply. There was no need. I didn't pull away, I said. I just stopped stretching myself past my limits. The words landed quietly. They looked at me, searching for emotion, anger, hurt, accusation. I offered none. Not because I was suppressing it, but because it wasn't there anymore. One of them said they never meant to make me feel unimportant, that they didn't realize. I believe you, I replied, and I did. Intent was never the issue. What they wanted next was absolution, something that would let the conversation resolve neatly. A reassurance that things could go back to how they were, with a few adjustments. But I wasn't there to negotiate terms. I'm not angry, I said, and I'm not asking for anything. I just live differently now. That was the moment the conversation shifted. They realized slowly that this wasn't a conflict to be resolved. It was a reality to be accepted. There was nothing to argue against, no emotional hook to pull on. Silence settled between us again, not awkward, just final. They asked if I still cared about the family. Yes, I said. I just don't disappear inside it anymore. That answer ended the discussion more effectively than any confrontation could have. There was no apology that followed, at least not a complete one. No sudden clarity, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed beyond repair, and that was enough. I left that conversation lighter than I had arrived, not because I had been heard fully, but because I hadn't needed to be. Confrontation without heat doesn't give people a target. It doesn't invite defense or counterattack. It simply states the truth and lets it stand. That day I didn't reclaim my power. I confirmed it. And confirmation is quieter than victory, but far more stable. Who I am now isn't defined by distance or defiance. It's defined by alignment. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't shed my past or become someone unrecognizable. I still value calm. I still listen more than I speak. I still believe in kindness, but those traits no longer come at the cost of my visibility, to myself or to others. The biggest change is internal. I no longer measure my worth by how little I require. I no longer confuse adaptability with strength, and I no longer translate other people's comfort into my responsibility. My life is quieter now, but not in the way it used to be. Before, quiet meant absence. Now it means intention. I choose where my energy goes. I invest it where it's reciprocated. I don't rush to fill silences that aren't mine to manage. I allow other people to experience the consequences of their assumptions without cushioning the impact. That doesn't make me cold. It makes me honest. My relationship with my family still exists, but it's different. There's more space, more formality, less expectation, and strangely more respect, not because I demanded it, but because I stopped offering unlimited access to myself. They see me now, not fully, not perfectly, but more clearly than before, not because I explained who I was, but because I demonstrated it consistently. And that's the part I wish I had understood earlier. Visibility doesn't come from insisting you matter. It comes from acting as though you already do. I've also changed the way I relate to myself. I trust my pauses. I listen when something feels misaligned. I don't rush to override my instincts in favor of keeping peace. That trust has become the foundation of everything else. My work, my relationships, my sense of direction. I no longer feel the need to be impressive, or indispensable, or endlessly accommodating. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm building a life that doesn't require me to disappear inside it. Sometimes I think about the version of me who was labeled a waste of space. Not with anger, with compassion. She was surviving in the only way she knew how. She believed silence was safety. She wasn't wrong, but safety is not the same as fulfillment. I didn't punish anyone for not seeing me. I simply stepped into a version of myself that didn't depend on their vision. The life they dismissed is no longer invisible, not because it demands attention, but because it stands where it belongs. And when you stand there long enough, people either adjust their perspective or they fall out of frame. Both outcomes are acceptable. There's a reason I waited to tell this story. Not because it was painful to remember, but because it took time to understand what it actually meant. For a long time, I thought the lesson was about neglect, or words that cut quietly, or how easy it is to disappear inside your own family. But that wasn't the truth at the center of it. The truth is simpler and harder. People don't always mistreat you because they're cruel. Sometimes they mistreat you because your silence makes it easy. Because your reliability absorbs their neglect. Because the version of you they know has been shaped around their comfort. That doesn't make them evil, but it does make the pattern real. I didn't change my life by demanding to be seen. I didn't heal by proving anyone wrong. And I didn't find peace by waiting for an apology that might never come in the form I needed. I changed my life by stepping out of the role that required me to disappear, by recognizing that being low maintenance can slowly turn into being overlooked, that being adaptable can become being assumed, that being quiet can invite others to decide who you are without ever asking. The most important moment in this story wasn't the anniversary dinner. It wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't even the realization that I held leverage. It was the moment I stopped translating other people's comfort into my responsibility. That choice didn't make me harder. It made it clearer. And clarity has consequences. Some people adjusted, some didn't. Some relationships deepened. Others became more distant. None of that was punishment. It was alignment. When you stop shrinking, the world doesn't always applaud, but it does respond. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. You don't need to announce your worth. You don't need to justify your boundaries. And you don't need to wait until someone finally sees you to start living as if you matter. The life they dismissed was no longer invisible, not because it demanded attention, but because it stopped hiding. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear why. Have you ever realized that you were being valued only for how convenient you were? And what happened when you stopped making yourself so easy to overlook?